Anyway, taking it on trust. This is centering upon naturalistic illustration in science as derived, as based upon the artistic revolution and naturalistic representation. And it sees it both as a very powerful tool for making matchable things in that Gombrichian sense. In a simple way, you know, do a cow's ears go in front or behind its horns? Not always an easy thing to envisage, but clearly a picture helps, and if you do a little sketch it helps. So there's a very simple kind of mechanism of matching there. But also I'm greatly concerned in this lecture with the way in which the mastery of naturalism can actually give a very powerful tool and cut in the other direction to give something which is unreal enormous degree of conviction. And David, in a sense, alluded to that word. Another would start with a cat and end up with a dragon. So I'm looking at this double-edged sword. The trust element of it, let me play a slightly silly game with you, and I crave your indulgence with this. This is audience participation, so it's a bit silly, but anyway, that's how we go. And this is where the whole thing starts, really, as a lecture. We know what this animal is, duck-billed platypus, yes? We know it's Australia, yes? How many people have seen a duck-billed platypus? A decent number. Of those who haven't seen it, how many of you think it doesn't exist? Nobody. Okay, I'll set a sharp and steady going. But it makes you think, doesn't it? That's what I mean by taking it on trust. And are we, in principle, those of us who've not seen a duck-billed platypus, believe in any better position than somebody who believed in unicorns in the Renaissance? Obviously, we've got much more evidence, but in the sense, the raw basic sense of saying, I have seen this thing and it's definitely there, we're not actually in a superior position in a way. I wouldn't wish to push that too far, but you can see the point, and it gives you an idea of what I mean by taking it on trust. The image of the duck-billed platypus is actually rather a good one to start with, and it also raises the question of what sort of image do we trust. The top image is a drawn image for Australasian Geographic Journal in 1988, so it's a relatively recent scientific context, and they commissioned Rod Scott to make the illustration. The one below is a photograph. Which do we trust? The duck-billed platypus at the top is actually rather better, isn't it, in conveying a range of information which perhaps in a photograph you can't see. The depth of field is a problem in that bottom photograph. The arm and hands, the webbed feet, become rather unclear. The way the shoulder abuts and presses out from the flesh, from the fur becomes unclear. The upper one also conveys the useful information that the animal lives in a burrow and that it moves into water and it's an aquatic animal. So there are all sorts of things there. The platypus, in fact, is a wonderful example of what do we trust. Its initial discovery for British naturalists is extraordinarily interesting and almost makes all my points for me. George Shaw at the British Museum published the platypus in Naturalist Weekly, in Naturalist Miscellany, not Weekly, in 1799. And these are some of the quotes. And he was sent a skin. He had a skin and a beak, and so on. And this is a wonderful example. Zola described naturalism as a corner of creation seen through a temperament. This is a corner of creation seen through the eyes of a very responsible and sceptical naturalist. This is just a small section, but it's a lovely text. Of all the mammalia yet known, it seems the most extraordinary in its configuration, exhibiting the perfect resemblance of the beak of a duck engrafted onto the head of a quadruped, so accurate in similitude that in first view it naturally exhibits the idea of some deceptive preparation by artificial means. There are lots of deceptive preparations. Aldo Randi had ones in his museum. You can still see some of them in Bologna at the Reconstructed Museum, and all the time. These often made there fakers quite a lot of money, these confected creatures. And so you have every reason to be. Nor is it without the most minute and rigid examination that we can persuade ourselves of it being the real beak or snout of a quadruped. Indeed, the duck-billed platypus looks like a wonderful candidate for fakery. The body is depressed and has some resemblance to an otter in miniature. It's covered by very thick, soft, beaver-like fur, moderately dark brown above. The tail is flat and furry, and he goes on describing it. He then says the beak is 3 inches in length. It's very important to give measurements, and at this time, by the 18th century, it gives us a kind of authenticity. And he accumulates these observations. Future observations made in its native regions will, it hoped, afford us some ample information and make us more fully acquainted with the natural history of an animal which differs so widely from other quadrupeds and which verifies in the most striking manner the observation of Buffon, viz. That whatever it was possible for nature to produce was actually being produced. He goes on to deduce it lives in aquatic circumstances and so on. On a subject so extraordinary as the present, a degree of scepticism is not only pardonable but laudable, and I ought perhaps to acknowledge that I almost doubt the testimony of my own eyes with respect to the structure of the animal's beak. I must confess that I can perceive no appearance of any deceptive preparation, emphasizing that again. It's a monument to what we should all do intellectually, is that faced with something which seems wonderful, exciting, and like a great discovery, to not believe it. That's a good recipe for people who have to attribute paintings to Leonardo. Don't believe it, don't believe it, don't believe it. And when it asserts itself in a very bloody-minded way, you begin to give it some credence. And I think that's a good lesson for anybody, particularly if we're looking for a kind of observation as a scientist, artist, or whatever, to keep questioning it and say, let's not believe it, let's assume it doesn't work like that. This is Shaw's own illustration based upon a skin, rather good. Gould is in the middle of that bottom group, and the other two I can't now remember what they are. But of course the context then helps. If you're wishing to give conviction to it, why not throw in another Australian animal, a koala bear with a baby? I suspect that is not a situation which is easily reconstructible in the wild in Australia. But of course it gives an Australia-ness to the whole thing and adds a level of conviction. And there are all these things, you could call them tricks, but they're habits of illustrators which are designed to trigger our assent through content or through some sheer conviction of putting these animals in particular contexts. The case study I'm going to use, the case studies I'm going to be using today are absolutely mega obvious, so, but they still yield some interesting results, I think. The first one is the unicorn, the legendary animal. This is from Gesner's four great volumes of natural history in the mid-16th century, and the unicorn is fairly convincing. A horse with a central horn, what's wrong with that? It's a fairly credible beast. The Struco camelo, the ostrich, is perhaps rather less credible. Of course, we look at one and with hindsight, we see that one is faintly absurd and implausible, and the other is a recognizable animal. But this is with hindsight. In contemporary eyes, I think this would not really have been the case. I'm going to look at this under four headings, that's 5 headings. It looks real enough, more real than the real, rhetorics of the real, superfluously real and matching the real. As I say, my sense of the real is this selective playing to certain triggers that convince us something is right and actually corresponds with something we see in nature. So real is not used in a totally naive way here.